Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the October edition. First of all, welcome to October. What an October it is so far. This has been nice. Of course, a lot of people are complaining about the temperature, but for me, I've been waiting for this since July, so I'm good. And the colors this year are as bright and pervasive as I've ever seen with the ground cover. And I just got back from New England and had an opportunity to see the foliage there, and it hasn't really turned yet. Came back here and said, wow, why did I go now? What was the deal? But it's been great. I'm starting just a couple of minutes early right now because I want to make an announcement. We kind of don't want to take too much time away from our speaker. But I am, for those, I think a lot of you know it, but I am retiring from the Draper. Those of you who don't know, by the way, I'm Chuck Preston. I'm the, who is this guy and why do we care? What is this? I'm the senior curator at the Draper Natural History Museum. It's been 20 years here, but part of a 46-year career in universities and museums about. But the last 20 and the longest stretch here at the center, and I've loved every minute of it. But I'll be around through December 31st. That's when I officially retire. And actually, I'll be around beyond that as a curator emeritus and a senior scientist here at the center. So they haven't gotten rid of me yet. I get to do all the fun stuff, spend more time in the field and more time writing and less time going to meetings. That's what I told them anyway. Probably still be writing a few grants here and there, but at any rate, we'll probably turn this microphone on lunchtime expeditions over to someone else after the first of the year in that. But one other housekeeping or bit of housekeeping to do, of course, is cell phones or other electronic devices. Now's a good time to turn those off or to vibrate. We have, we've carried the theme of golden eagles and sagebrush steppe primarily both through our Draper After Dark series and lunchtime expeditions this year, and we've looked at eagles and sagebrush steppe from so many different angles. How many of you were able to make Brian's talk last Draper After Dark was last week on cheatgrass? I know some of you were able to make that good. Another aspect, again, of what we're talking about in this whole fabric, this tapestry of sagebrush steppe that we own here in Wyoming, particularly, in fact, the largest vast expanses, unbroken expanses of it left pretty much in North America. And our speaker today has a great deal of familiarity with both that and golden eagles. He is currently a zoologist for the Wyoming Natural Diversity Database at the University of Wyoming. He spent many years compiling data and literature on golden eagles as part of really a continent-wide effort by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to develop different ecoregional strategies on conservation of golden eagles specifically. So he's working on conservation planning, long-term coexistence of eagles and people with development in the rapidly changing West. He earned his master's degree in wildlife sciences from Oregon State University. He's worked as a consultant to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, to industry groups, and to Native American tribes on the effects of human activities such as wind energy development that we've been talking about, and religious harvest with Native people on golden eagles. In his current position with the Wyoming Natural Diversity Database, his research also includes field studies and analyses of vertebrate species of concern, ranging from bats to amphibians to songbirds. So he's very has diverse interests, very flexible in what he does, and it's a real pleasure to have him here today. I first really heard about him when he worked for a colleague and good friend of mine in Arizona, an environmental consulting group, a fellow by the name of Dale Stoliker. And I think it was our speaker's job to keep Dale out of the river and into the work, because Dale loves to float the rivers down there. Please welcome today Zach Wallace.
Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks Chuck for the great introduction. Really glad to be here. This is my first chance to see the new eagle exhibit here, and for those of us who think golden eagles are pretty much the coolest animal on the planet, this is the place to be. So yeah, I'm Zach Wallace. I work as a zoologist at the Natural Diversity Database. That's our state wildlife heritage program, natural heritage program, and we're a service unit of the University of Wyoming in Laramie. As Chuck mentioned, I'm going to talk today about some conservation planning work that I've been working on for the last few years. Yeah. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So Chuck asked me here today to talk about some conservation planning work that I've been doing in collaboration with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Western Golden Eagle team, and specifically conservation planning for the Wyoming Basin. So I'm going to start with this quote from the author N. Scott Momaday from his book House Made of Dawn. And he says, "The eagle ranges far and wide over the land, farther than any other creature, and all things there are related simply by having existence in the perfect vision of a bird." And I've come back to this quote during my work on eagle conservation. I think the first part is pretty obvious. Eagles range far and wide. This is a map of movement tracks. I think it may have some of your data in it, compiled by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And it shows how eagles really range all over the continent. They cross political borders, they move between diverse ecosystems, so eagles range far and wide. The second part of the quote, though, speaks to me about the complex ecology and the mythology of this species and how they relate to so many aspects of human culture. So what things are connected and related to us through the lens of the golden eagle? Well, I think that eagles connect with our hearts and our minds and our spirits, if you go there. And indeed, in America, our reverence for eagles, both bald eagles and golden eagles, is enshrined in law under the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. And this legislation provides for golden eagles a standard of protection that is in some ways even higher than the Endangered Species Act. And that level of protection leads us to some of the other ways, some of the less obvious ways that we're connected with golden eagles every day, like our choices about how we develop and consume energy resources, the landscapes where we choose to live and grow our food, even our choices about how and where we recreate can have impacts to golden eagles. So all these hazards that humans knowingly or unknowingly pose to golden eagles, combined with their high degree of legal protection and the sensitivity of their populations, make the conservation of this species a complex and challenging task. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So I'll start out with an introduction to the Wyoming Basin, which is the study area for the conservation planning work that I've been involved in. Tell you about the habitat of golden eagles in the region, breeding, winter, and migration. And then I'll talk about conservation and management of eagles. So quick review of their population status, some hazards to the species, and then I'll tell you about our conservation work specifically. So first, just to get you oriented to our study area, this is the area that we're calling the Wyoming and Uinta Basins Conservation Strategy Area. So it's about 60,000 square miles, mainly in Wyoming, small parts of Montana and Idaho, and a little more of Colorado and Utah. And it's made up primarily of the Wyoming Basin Ecoregion, and here we are in Cody. The Wyoming Basin covers most of Wyoming west of the Rocky Mountain front and excluding the major mountain ranges. So to that we added the Uinta Basin and Tavaputs Plateau region. This is an area in east central Utah and northwestern Colorado that we thought was ecologically similar to the Wyoming Basin, more so than to the Colorado Plateau, so we included it in the area. And finally, North Park, Colorado, the open basin around Walden, Colorado, another area that is similar to the Wyoming Basin from the perspective of eagles. So overall, this area is broad, open, high desert basins and defined by the surrounding ranges of the Rocky Mountains. And this is a pretty good picture of a characteristic landscape in the Wyoming Basin. It's a shrubland dominated by sagebrush steppe, desert shrublands, foothills shrublands, some areas of pure grassland. Overall, very limited amount of forest, some juniper woodlands, scattered aspen groves, but wide open sagebrush country like you all are familiar with. Land ownership, which is relevant to wildlife management, heavily dominated by public lands, Bureau of Land Management lands shown there in the creamy yellow color, followed by private lands in white, some state and tribal lands as well. Very little Forest Service ownership in this assessment area, mainly just because it cuts out the forested mountain regions. This area also has a very low human population density, limited amount of agriculture due mostly to the climate, and fairly extensive conventional energy development. So on the left we can see active oil and gas wells in red, active coal permits in gray. We also have a growing renewable energy sector. So on the right you can see existing wind farms in black, and then those shades of blue show the wind power classes, which is like wind speeds. And the Wyoming Basin really has some of the highest sustained wind speeds of anywhere on the North American continent that's not right on top of a mountain range. Another important thing to know about the Wyoming Basin is that it may be the best golden eagle habitat in North America. There are a lot of ways to define what is the best habitat, so I won't make that claim outright. But there's no doubt that the Wyoming Basin and Wyoming as a state provide really continentally significant golden eagle habitat. So I want to show you this map. This is from a publication by Ryan Nielsen et al. And it shows intensity of use by golden eagles across the western US. It's based on aerial counts of eagles that they do in the late summer. And the take home from this is that those warmer colors, the yellows and oranges, show the predicted intensity of use for eagles. And you can see that Wyoming and the Wyoming Basin are, you know, the largest and brightest areas on that map. And I can't show it to you today because it's still in draft form, but so this is made with counts of individual eagles, but the Fish and Wildlife Service is working on a similar map made using a really different method. They used nest locations, but it tells a really similar story about the huge importance of this region for eagles. So what's so good about this area? Well, that's Oregon Butte. It's actually a pretty cool area. So what do golden eagles need? Well, for breeding, they need elevated sites to build their nests. They need those sites to be surrounded by larger areas of intact native vegetation that support abundant prey populations. In some parts of the country, they nest on huge steep cliffs, but it turns out in the Wyoming Basin, they'll nest on lower eroded slopes like the Badlands that we see there. And so, you know, we have a lot of this kind of habitat in the Wyoming Basin, and just driving here diagonally across the state from Laramie, it turns out we were driving through basically pretty awesome golden eagle habitat for 7 hours. And you can't do that in a lot of places in the US. So here's a few nest site photos. More than 75% of known nests in the Wyoming Basin are on cliffs or other geologic features like rock outcrops and badland slopes. This one up here on the left is Sandstone Cliff here in the Bighorn Basin. Those other two are down in Uinta County. You can see the eagles on the nests and some alternate nest sites near them. So in this region, dominated by cliff nesting. They will use trees when they're available. Here's a nest in a Doug fir, nest in a cottonwood. In some situations, they'll use human-made structures, not all. This is on a transmission, or not a transmission, some kind of tower. Anyone know what that is? Cell phone tower or something? Over by Rawlins. So there's an eagle nest on that in an area where there's maybe nothing else higher than this stage for them to nest on. They use that. And so I'm going to transition here a little bit, and I want to say, you know, everyone loves looking at maps. I know I do. And I also work a lot with maps because, in my opinion, I think the currency of modern conservation work is really maps. You know, if you can't map it, it's really hard to conserve it. And so a lot of our conservation planning efforts involve trying to make models of eagle habitat, make maps based on those models, and then use those maps to inform conservation. So to map golden eagle habitat, and I don't want to get too technical here, because really I think it's pretty straightforward. We take our conceptual model, or our idea of what good golden eagle habitat is, so these locally elevated nesting areas surrounded by extensive and undisturbed native vegetation, and then we can use data sets and math to formalize those conceptual models into a statistical model. And that lets us then predict where golden eagle habitat is on the landscape and map it. Because we can't survey every square inch of the Wyoming Basin for golden eagle habitat. We don't have enough interns to do that. So instead, we need a consistent scientific method that lets us map the habitat based on where we predict it to be. So what we end up with is a map like this. This is a map that I was involved in making based on a model from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Western Golden Eagle team. We used thousands of nest locations in the Wyoming Basin, and we end up with this map. The darker colors show areas that golden eagles select for nesting, and then the lighter colors show areas that are used less. So I want to point out a few things about this map. I don't know if I have a laser pointer. Oh no. Okay, I'll just tell you about them. So the first thing you notice is that these dark purple areas, those are big concentrations of nesting habitat. So you can see some kind of in the middle of the map. Those dark purple areas, those are like the Sweetwater rocks. If you take the south way from Casper over to Lander, all those granite boulders, those pop out. You can see all the great dark purple habitat along the western edge of the Bighorn Basin. Down here at the very bottom, you can see all the canyons on the north slope of the Tavaputs Plateau there in the Uinta Basin. See Flaming Gorge Reservoir there, south and west of Rock Springs, and all the cliffs just north of the reservoir there. So we can pick out these really good areas where we'd guess there's nesting golden eagles. But the other thing I want you to notice about this map, and this isn't true of all places in the western US, is that there's a little bit of purple almost everywhere on this map. So you can look even in the Great Divide Basin, there's some little purple dots. And what those smaller dark areas are all the little, buttes and rims and badlands and all this variation in terrain across the basin that ends up providing suitable nesting habitat for golden eagles most places in the Wyoming Basin. So this model, it was made with nest sites, covers the breeding habitat of eagles, but it also applies to some extent in the winter, because we know eagles in the Wyoming Basin, mostly they're non-migratory. The breeding pairs tend to hang around their territories. They use a bigger area, but they still stay grounded to those nest sites. So we can apply this to some extent also in the winter. But what about those southbound long-distance migrants that come down from Alaska and Canada to winter in Wyoming for some reason, rather than going further? They stop in Wyoming and hang out here. So we wanted to make a model to capture those birds as well, but because we couldn't focus it on nest sites, we had to use movement data from eagles with GPS backpacks like the one that Dr. Preston's been deploying in the area around here. So this is a model, another model. It's at a slightly coarser scale because of the nature of the data. We see some areas that are used more in winter than breeding, but on the whole, we see pretty good agreement between breeding and winter habitats. And I think that speaks to the fact that these intact native habitats, the same ones that support jackrabbits and cottontails, also contribute to the ungulate populations that eagles use more in the winter as roadkill or winter kill. So that's our winter model. I'm not going to say too much about migration. We're still working on migration modeling. If you're interested in learning more, is Brian's talk still scheduled for December 6th? Yeah, okay. He's Brian Bedrosian from Teton Raptor Center. He's kind of a regional expert on eagle migration, and he'll be giving a talk there. But Brian gave me these figures from a paper of his that's going to be published soon. So the one thing I wanted to point out about migration specifically in this area is that he's mapped these migration tracks coming down from Alaska, and we see predominantly they skirt the eastern side of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem on the western edge of the Bighorn Basin, and then they follow the east side of the winds down until they hit the Great Divide and Green River Basin, and then they fan out. So What that suggests to me from the perspective of the Wyoming Basin is that a lot of the birds that come down the Rockies end up spreading out and passing through the Wyoming Basin rather than, say, going east of the Bighorns and the Laramie Range there along the prairie. So a lot more to learn about migration, and that's something we still haven't integrated fully into conservation planning. But check out Brian's talk. So we have lots of great eagle habitat. We have a high degree of legal protection, but how are their populations doing? Is all this concern about wind power development and other impacts really warranted? So unfortunately, there's not trend data specific to the state of Wyoming. It's hard to make a call about how the populations are doing here. So we can look bigger. We can look at broad scale trend data from all of North America. That suggests that golden eagle populations have been more or less stable in the last few decades. We can also look to local or regional scale studies like Dr. Preston's work and all the great studies that are summarized on the interactive screen in the exhibit. And those studies are equivocal. Some of them have found declines, others haven't. So it's basically unclear. But there's a third option, which is kind of nerdy, but I'm going to try to tell you about it. And that's using demographic models to take the characteristics of a golden eagle population and project the trend into the future. So what does that mean? Well, when we think about golden eagle demography and the sensitivity, the inherent sensitivity of their populations to hazards, it's important to consider that they have what we call a slow life history. And some of you might have heard this term before. They don't reach sexual maturity and breed until they're 4 or 5 years old. They have relatively low reproductive rates when they do breed. So the few studies that I summarized for the Wyoming Basin, the average was about 70% nest success. When the nest does succeed, about 1.5 chicks on average. They're also long-lived. And so with all species that have a slow life history, eagles included, since they don't succeed at breeding every year, they don't make a lot of young when they do breed, it's critical that the adults in that population survive a long time so that they can have multiple breeding attempts to sustain the population. And in that case, as a population ecologist, we say that adult survival is the key parameter that drives population performance. So the key component to conserve is those adults. So this graph shows the results of one of those demographic models, projecting the long-term trend in golden eagle populations in all of North America from 2009 to 100 years in the future. It's thousands of eagles on the vertical axis. And I want to point out a couple things here without spending too long on a ugly graph like this. And the first thing is that top solid line with the 0 next to it, that's the predicted trend of the population given current levels of human-caused mortality. Okay, so we predict a decline even with the current level of mortality. So say we add the next line down, we add 1% additional human-caused mortality, we get that trend. So by the time we add, say, a fairly modest increase in mortality, 3%, that decline is pretty dramatic. So, you know, the other thing to think about is that given that slow life history of golden eagles, any decline that occurs, it's going to take a long time to make that up. So I would argue that even though we don't have specific data in the state of Wyoming saying this species is declining by this much in this year, just the inherent characteristics of the populations of these species give us reason to have a higher level of concern and caution. So what hazards are we talking about? I'm just going to run through some of them. Electrocution, okay, on power infrastructure. This is actually a major source of mortality for eagles. Golden eagles are more vulnerable than other birds just simply because of their size, their broad wingspan, and their body length. It just makes it more likely that they're going to connect two components on a power pole. And it happens mostly on distribution poles, in part because the components are spaced closer together, and also because there's just, when you start to think about it, there's a massive number of those things out on the landscape. So a lot of chances for golden eagles to interact with them. The risk factors are complex. It's hard to know, better eagle habitat quality, where the power poles are can affect risk. Younger birds get electrocuted more often. The specific configurations of the poles affect it too. So electrocution is a considerable risk. Let's see, wind turbine strike. So this is an increasing source of mortality for golden eagles. We've learned that it can affect individuals from a wide area around a wind farm, so it's not just the ones that breed right in that area, but migrants and dispersing young birds and others. Like electrocution, complex risk factors, it depends on where they site the wind farm, where they site the turbines, how tall the towers are, how long the blades are, how old the eagles are. So a lot to think about from a scientific perspective in terms of putting a finer point on the risk of wind turbine collision. The other thing that I mentioned before, but I want to really underline this, is that Wyoming has one of the best wind resources in the country. We have more than 50% of areas with the highest ranked wind capacity in the continental US are in the state of Wyoming. And southeastern Wyoming, and I live in Laramie, so I can tell you that it's windy there, but when we look at the data, they confirm my experience, which is that is it's the largest contiguous area where wind speeds exceed 8.5 meters per second on average in the whole US. So there's a huge wind energy play going on down there right now. And unfortunately, those tremendous wind resources coincide with some of our really high quality golden eagle habitat resources. The other thing to point out about wind turbine strike is that this is, in our conservation planning, the only hazard to golden eagles that has an established framework from the Fish and Wildlife Service to issue permits to wind developers, and then there's a framework for mitigating what they call take, which is the killing of eagles at wind farms. And the way that they do that is actually through retrofitting power poles. So getting back to electrocution, putting caps on the power poles to prevent electrocution. Vehicle collision, this is a major source of mortality. You all may have seen eagles hit on the road. I'm sure probably most of you have seen eagles feeding on big game killed on the road. We think that the risk increases during winter. There's been some interesting work from a couple of research groups in the state here to suggest that the spots where ungulates cross and get hit, and then eagles get hit feeding on ungulates, are predictable. People are even suggesting removal of carcasses, dragging carcasses off the road as a way to save eagles as a mitigation strategy. So some interesting work on that, and we'll learn a lot more soon. Let's see, I also have conventional energy development up here. So oil and gas, mining, power generation. These are not hazards to eagles per se, but the infrastructure and activities associated with conventional energy development may increase some other known hazards to eagles, right? So electrocution on distribution and transmission infrastructure, collisions with vehicles on haul roads, increased access for recreation and potentially persecution of eagles with the new road systems punched into previously undisturbed areas, disturbance of nesting eagles from activities like maintaining and building oil and gas wells. Eagles even drown in oil pits. It's rare, but it's documented. So this is like our list of all the ways an eagle can die, kind of a morbid talk, but I want to get through all these. Contaminants, right? Eagles are long-lived. They can bioaccumulate toxins over their long life. They're also what we call facultative scavengers, so they kill live prey, but they also eat dead stuff, and the eating dead stuff part gets them in trouble with contaminants. So lead is the big one here. Eagles get lead poisoning from consuming big game gut piles or eating other animals that are shot with lead ammunition. This x-ray on the left is actually a California condor that's ingested lead fragments. And the one on the right is just a mule deer that's been shot with a lead bullet. And I'm always amazed when I see these x-rays, just the spread of the fragments in the carcass. So it's a concern. And eagles can die from lead poisoning just like people can. But just like people, they can also experience negative effects from sub-lethal doses of lead. So I'm not going to interpret these plots too closely, but I think they're super interesting. This is a study from Sweden of eagles that were eating moose carcasses, and they had GPS backpacks on the eagles, and they showed that the ones with higher lead burdens were flying lower and slower than the other eagles. and they can also get disoriented. So they hypothesized that potentially eagles with a higher lead burden could be at greater risk of, say, getting hit by a vehicle or running into a wind turbine. So also some pretty scary interactive effects between some of these hazards. Another one, anticoagulant rodenticides like Rosol that people use to kill prairie dogs and ground squirrels. These have relatively recently been recognized as a threat to raptors in general, and that includes eagles. Another example that I came across in the Wyoming Game and Fish mortality database, pentobarbital. It's a livestock euthanasia agent. There were 5 eagles near Rawlins that were killed from feeding on animals that had been treated with that. And so with these types of things, there are some simple measures that you could take, burying a carcass or composting it rather than just leaving it out, that could prevent that. Let's see, golden eagles are affected by different diseases and parasites. I'm not going to get into this too much. None of them are very prevalent here yet, with the exception of some West Nile cases in wet years. Trichomoniasis they get from eating rock pigeons in areas where their other prey species crash, so they're eating pigeons, and that affects their throat. Leukocytozoonosis from black flies. Mexican chicken bugs, a guy did his master's over in the Snake River Plain on this recently, and it's horrible. They're bed bugs in an eagle nest, and the young die from these. So a lot of these things we don't have yet in the Wyoming Basin, but in a warming world with changing precipitation regimes and changing prey habitat, these are some things that people like Chuck who are climbing into eagle nests and other researchers are keeping a close eye out for. And I'm sorry I have to mention this, but poaching and persecution of eagles still occurs in the Wyoming Basin. Several people were recently caught up in a sting of an eagle poaching ring in Wyoming. Persecution also occurs. I mean, eagles are in some cases real and in many cases perceived predators of livestock. That may or may not contribute to the general animosity towards predators. It is illegal to kill or harm eagles, and so in the short term, the only solution is law enforcement, and in the long term, hopefully education. So far I've been talking about things that kill eagles, but another hazard are activities that disturb eagles. So the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act defines take as killing eagles, but also as disturbance that could reduce productivity or cause nest abandonment. So a few things that can cause that, I'll just run over here. First I want to mention, I mean, in terms of eagle management and raptor management out there on the ground in Wyoming, the majority of what we do that we actually call raptor management are putting nest buffers around known nests for industrial activities, right? So oil and gas development, BLM, Forest Service, other public lands, they have stipulations that they need to put a buffer where they won't disturb an eagle nest. But there's also some interesting research coming out of Idaho as well recently that some of our recreational activities like ATV, OHV riding, and hiking can also cause disturbance sufficient to cause an eagle nest to fail. So I'm encouraged by some of the proactive and collaborative approaches that I know I've visited with Dr. Preston about here in the Bighorn Basin. So some good opportunities to reduce disturbance to eagle nests there. And finally, I can't show my face here and not talk about prey resource limitation, because Dr. Preston has done kind of the gold standard of work on this issue with golden eagles. And you know, it's obvious intuitively that we need prey populations for golden eagles, but unfortunately, it's a hard one to include in the maps and models that we do, because we can do prey surveys at a small scale, but it's hard to do planning for prey habitat across a huge region. So I think, you know, the work that Dr. Preston and others are doing on this to try to expand our concept of raptor habitat to include the habitat of raptors' prey is really important, and I hope that sometime in the future we'll get to the point where we know enough about those relationships that we can actively manage and restore prey habitat to improve productivity of eagles. So in the face of all these threats, that was the dreary part of the talk. Now I'm going to get a little more positive. In the face of all these threats, what can we do to conserve eagle populations? And from my perspective as a spatial ecologist, where can we do that to achieve the greatest possible benefit? Well, you've probably all seen these maps of the longest mule deer migration from the Wyoming Migration Initiative, recently discovered in Wyoming. And if you follow the news on wildlife conservation in Wyoming, you also probably know that it's harder than you'd think to conserve habitat for an important charismatic species, even when you know right where it is, and it's this linear and discrete piece of habitat, right? So what do we do when the resource that we want to conserve is the breeding habitat of golden eagles, and our map looks like this? It's everywhere, right? So in some ways, that's really hard because we can't conserve everywhere, but in other ways, it's good because it gives us some options. So our approach has been to conservation planning that it's all about probability. We need to identify where the most important habitat occurs, and then we want to identify which of those areas are most threatened by key hazards to golden eagles. So the goal of our conservation work was to develop a consistent approach that we could use to prioritize areas for conservation and for development, and we did it at this ecoregional scale because we wanted to do it large enough that it would actually be relevant to a wide-ranging species like a golden eagle. So to do this, we combined those eagle habitat models or maps that I showed you before, the breeding one on the left here now, and the winter one on the right. We combined those with spatial data that we had on hazards to golden eagles. So wind speed, electrocution risk, oil and gas development risk, exposure to lead from gut piles, and we made what we call spatially explicit risk assessments. And we use a special color scheme to map these so that we can see the overlap of the eagle habitat with the risk. So in these maps, the shades of green are eagle habitat quality. So again, breeding on the left and winter on the right. And then the shades of orange show the risk. So in this case, wind power class, which is like a proxy for wind development risk. And then the purple areas show the overlap between those. We can also interpret it to show conservation opportunities in green, where we've got great eagle habitat, but the winds don't blow enough to put a wind farm there, or development opportunities in orange, where the wind blows hard enough to build a turbine, but eagle habitat isn't that good. And then again, the purple areas are areas where greater risk of conflict. So you immediately see some purple areas popping out, like say the portion of the Bighorn Basin in Montana, or a whole bunch of southeastern Wyoming. But you also see a handful of orange areas where there's maybe opportunity for development with lower risk for eagles. And those are the areas that we hope wind development companies would consult these maps and proactively target, because the burden of building a wind farm and killing eagles can be huge financially and logistically on these firms. So we're thinking of this as a proactive way to help them site smarter for their benefit and the benefit of eagles. Of course, there are a lot of other factors that go into deciding where to site a wind farm, like state and county permits. You can't even build a wind farm in Sweetwater County, for example. Access to transmission, other species like sage grouse. But we developed these models to be used at a broad scale and combined with local knowledge on those other factors by industry. And we also think that these could be useful for agency biologists and NGOs and other interested stakeholders when they're reviewing project proposals to try and place the amount of risk posed by a proposal in a broader context of the region. So not just not in my backyard, but is this objectively a risky place to do this? And then for each of those hazards, we make recommendations on conservation measures or management actions that can be targeted in those high-risk areas identified on the maps to try and provide the greatest possible benefit to golden eagles. So we follow the mitigation hierarchy for these, with the gold standard being avoidance. So if we can avoid the impact altogether, that's the best. And so for wind farms, that would include smart siting and design, put the wind farm away from eagle habitat, within the wind farm, put the turbines away from the best eagle habitat. Once a wind farm is built, turbine curtailment is something that people are doing. That's what these pictures are. This is at the top of the World Wind Farm by Glenrock. And those are trained observers, and that is a trained expert robot camera that, that spot golden eagles and turn off turbine strings when they're in the area. And that's because it's expensive enough to kill a golden eagle that they're motivated to do this. So that's an option. And then again, like I mentioned, mitigation, once they're predicted to take an eagle or they take an eagle, then they can retrofit power poles according to the procedure set out by the service to offset that take. We also make recommendations on monitoring. So what types of data are we lacking as scientists to be able to get a better handle on this problem and support adaptive management of eagles? So here's one for electrocution risk. We overlap the eagle models with a model of distribution pole density. So these are high risk areas for electrocution, eagle habitat in green, power pole density in orange, and then risk of electrocution in purple. So we can use these. We aren't gonna not build power poles in good golden eagle habitat, but we can use these to prioritize areas to retrofit where we expect a greater benefit to eagles for retrofitting a power pole in one area over another. And you can see some parts of this map, those orange parts, the power pole density is really pretty high, but you would be getting less bang for your buck in terms of your retrofitting dollars for eagle conservation if you went and retrofitted poles in a place where the eagle habitat isn't that good. So we're hoping that these tools are going to be used by the service for that and also by electrical utilities. So getting back to conservation measures, avoidance, you can't actually build a power pole with the components spaced far enough that it's really unlikely to electrocute an eagle. So that's the best thing to do. Power pole retrofits are great for minimization and mitigation. And then we also have, again, recommendations for monitoring. So we need to know more about where and when eagles are electrocuted. We also need better monitoring of the retrofits because we've learned from some recent studies, you've all probably seen those triangles that they put out on the power poles. Those are called perch discouragers. And there's been some recent work that showed that if those aren't installed correctly, or if the caps on the electrical components aren't installed correctly, it actually increases the risk. So if you put a perch discourager on, they say, I'm not going to perch there, I'll perch right here on this electrified component. So there are a lot of opportunities for education within the industry, linemen and power providers on how to make that work better. So we also did risk assessments for oil and gas development. I won't get into that. Lead exposure from big game carcasses. And these are all going to be available as a part of a conservation strategy report that will be done this winter. So I hope I've convinced you today that we are lucky to live in the Wyoming Basin, which is a region with some of the best golden eagle habitat in the world. And I hope I've also been able to teach you something you didn't know about how eagles are affected by the competing demands that our lifestyles place on the landscape, from energy development and transportation to recreation. And the conservation planning resources I've told you about are part of an effort, I think, to try and balance those needs at least a little bit. So we hope that the tools we've developed, like the risk maps and these sets of recommendations, can help advance eagle conservation and do that in a way that's science-based and collaborative and proactive. So I have a lot of people to thank. I'm not going to read everyone's names, but mainly my collaborators at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Western Golden Eagle team, but also the many people involved in collecting and modeling the data that go into these assessments and planning resources. So I don't know how much time I have, but I'd be happy to take some questions.
Yeah, we have time for a quick question.
Yeah. They have been receptive, and I think they're receptive because we're trying to offer them something proactively that can save them some heartburn later on. And I was struck, I went to a energy summit at the University of Wyoming recently, and there was a guy there who is he works in an Argentinian worldwide mining conglomerate, and they're proposing a huge wind farm down in Shirley Basin over by Laramie. And someone asked him, how did you decide where to put this thing? And he said, we just looked at the wind map and went to the darkest area. So we've got people from all over the world looking at maps of Wyoming like any other energy play, trying to figure out where they might want to do this. Yeah. Did you have a question here in the front?
Migration routes. Do people have to go up on the ridges and mount raptors?
They do some. There's a site at Commissary Ridge down by Kemmer that Hawkwatch International has done for, I don't know how long they've been there, but 15 years or something. And there are accounts in the greater Yellowstone, right?
Yeah, mine are in Greater Yellowstone. I actually, along with Colorado Bird Observatory, founded one near Denver, just 16 miles away from downtown Denver, which is a very active fall site, not so much spring.
Mm-hmm.
It varies. Yeah, they're stationed throughout the Rockies. There are a number of different sites. But that's not the only way that
Right.
We get a sense of migration.
Right, and I think what you're getting at is that, we call them collars because we're wildlife people, but they're really GPS solar-powered backpack units, have gotten small enough and affordable enough that we're putting them on all kinds of raptors. And the ones that fit on a golden eagle, which are smaller than a Snickers bar and pretty lightweight, they can last 5 years on solar power, and some of them are giving, really high resolution data like every minute. So that's the way forward on migration mapping. And Brian will say a lot about that. That's his main research focus. Anybody else? Yeah. It was banned for waterfowl.
Yeah, banned waterfowl back in the 90s, as a matter of fact. Since the 1990s, it's lead shot for shotguns. It was banned on federal lands during the Obama administration. That was lifted by Secretary Zinke as soon as the first action, I think, when he came into office, was to remove that ban. Pending further study. Waterfowl still banned, yes. But the issue, and Zach can speak to this eloquently, but lead shot that we recognized for a long time, because waterfowl hunters use those over water, which everything picks up in the water. We weren't as knowledgeable about lead ammunition for rifles. And the thought was, well, it's only faulty ammunition that would fragment or something, so it's an anomaly. But in fact, you saw the radiograph that Zach showed here. It is profound when you see these again and again and again. You've probably looked at dozens or hundreds of them than I have. It's just amazing how lead ammunition fragments when it gets into the carcass.
Mm-hmm. And that's one where there have been some voluntary programs to replace lead ammunition, and most of those have been centered around California condor conservation because that species is so critically endangered, so few individuals.
I believe California actually, it is illegal in some areas, at least some sections of California, because of the California condor, to use lead ammunition. In Arizona, though, it's been voluntary primarily from the sporting community.
Right.
Recognizing the importance there. So they've gone with either copper or steel jacketed ammunition.
Right, and I wouldn't tell anyone what to shoot, but I do think about, I look at that and picture what I'm eating too, so I use copper ammo. Yes? We have, so the Fish and Wildlife Service team that's putting these assessments together for other regions has interacted with wind energy companies and oil and gas companies. And I've interacted in developing this document for the Wyoming Basin mainly with agency biologists. So BLM, state, Forest Service. And they've relayed some of the concerns of the energy companies that they work with to try to permit projects. Oh, right. Yeah, so wind is funded. Wind has the Wyoming Natural Diversity Database, which is our state natural heritage program, is funded partially with a state block grant because we maintain a database of location data for rare plants and animals all over the state. And then the other stream of our funding are grants, and those can come from mainly from agencies. We don't do work directly for energy companies, although the Mining Association, Petroleum Association, a lot of those people use our data, which is part of the goal of having a kind of an unbiased scientific repository for data. But this project is funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, so they contracted me to develop this assessment. Yeah.
I will say that energy companies throughout, especially the western United States, have become more prominent funders for basic research in this. We've been funded, for example, in Bighorn Basin by a couple of different energy groups who really, I mean, they want better information. The onus is on them to either minimize or mitigate electrocutions or other deaths, wind turbine deaths or others, and so they want the best information when they do that.
Any other questions? Yeah.
One more question.
What is it in the Bighorn Basin?
Yeah, the Bighorn Basin, fairly dense population. It's difficult when you look at the entire landscape and say, okay, we've got this many territories, we've got this much landscape out there, and so we just do a real simple arithmetic really to figure out the density. But they're clustered because of the nesting substrate, so it's not the overall area. In general, we find our nearest nest distances are about 2 kilometers apart, and the average is closer to about 4.5 to 5 kilometers apart from the center of territory in those clusters.
And your study area, I would say, is on the higher end of habitat quality, and so you get out in the Great Divide Basin or parts of the Green River Basin where there's just not a lot of nesting habitat, and the spacing could be much wider there.
Miles, I mean, in some areas 60 miles apart.
Right, and
Yeah, we have
Yeah.
a fairly dense population, and that's territories. Doesn't mean that those birds are breeding every year, but it is a dense population in those clusters. Yet if you look at the overall Bighorn Basin, because the nesting substrates are just not available in a big part of it, then you start looking at 15 to 20 kilometers between nest sites on average. So it depends on how you refine the analysis.
thank you. I guess that's it for questions?
Thank you.
All right, thank you.